Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here to participate in these discussions. And in particular, I want to extend my thanks to Mike Brennan for making sure you told me about this quite a while back on a personal level. And I also want to thank Tom for all of the discussions we had prior to my committing to do this this chat. I have my foot in different areas. First of all, in the working with the private sector, working with the public sector, and in between. And so it's from that vantage point that I'll be just covering some talking points from the perspectives of a foundation, an NGO, or product development partnerships who are all represented here. So the things I wanted to cover is just essentially to amplify on the gaps. And so when we have these gaps, where would we prioritize as harmonization being needed? And what are the gaps themselves and the barriers to closing them? I'll have a few examples of approaches that are not necessarily recent, but they're good all the same, and then some thoughts going forward. However, just to set the stage, I focus from the Gates Foundation perspective on broad array of products. That is medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, and all. So what we see there is what I like to paint to you as the environment and the universe that people like us are operating in. Is really to assure that you have a product, not only a product that you apply innovation to develop expeditiously, but also to make it affordable. So when you put all of those together, the value chain is what is important to focus on, the entire end-to-end value chain, from the development perspective and registration, which, by the way, has a little bit more nuance to it than most people are used to, in the sense that it's not just registration through like an FDA or an EMA, but also in order to qualify to be procured by UN agencies and made affordable to the countries of interest, they have to undergo WHO pre-qualification or some filter of quality assurance before they fall into that category. So there are things to bear in mind in that regard. And of course, beyond that, the countries themselves that these products are going to have to register them. So an FDA-approved product or an EMA-approved product does not necessarily automatically go to the regions or the low-income countries that they're intended for. So it's the issues, the harmonization perspectives that are needed in those regions that we have to focus on. And of course, there are post-registrational activities as well that span the entire spectrum of the areas that I mentioned. So when we look at the ranking of the most challenging areas where harmonization is needed, I can say unequivocally, just from the perspective that we face, that devices and diagnostic tools are the most challenging as of today. Primarily, they lack international standards. So I'm talking technical standards now. And I think that's foremost, to assure that there's some technical standards that's available that everybody can operate by, that can foster innovation. And after all, the whole purpose of what every one of us here is concerned about doing is to assure that we apply some technology to have innovative products that will be introduced and accessed for impact. That's really all we're about, products. Rules, regulations, and so on are important, but at the end of the day is to come up with a product that is a solution to a health issue in the world. So when you look at it at that, from that perspective, the absence of international standards in the diagnostic spectrum actually has some significant impact. We know, for example, that whether it spans the platform technology of which diagnostics and especially diagnostics are based, or the assurance of what constitutes what a manufacturer should be looking for as to the number of tests they should perform, or, in fact, the specificities and sensitivities of the equipment or the tools that they build, a lot of issues there. So it's very easy to get into the market because the penalty for bad behavior is actually low, minuscule. When you look at the diagnostics, for example, rapid tests for malaria diagnostics, I think the WHO has statistics on the low quality overall that exists in the environments where these tools are used. So there's an impact that is involved in the absence of these international standards. Moving on to the other category of products that are still a challenge, not quite as bad as for diagnostics, is probably what you may not all be familiar with. These are public health pesticide products, and when you look at that category of products, the only real group that's looking at some standards to regulate and manage this whole group of products is the WHO pesticide scheme for evaluating these pesticides. It's a de facto group that needs a lot of support and help. The problem being that, again, the impact is there's a real stalling of innovation in this regard. You need new tools, but what has happened in this area is that there are no new active ingredients that have been developed specifically for pesticide products in the past several years. What has happened is a repurposing of agricultural tools, agricultural products. And why this is so is because, in point of fact, there is no standards, there's no understanding, there's no requirement of how to get a new active ingredient to focus directly on public health pesticide products, vector control products. So that has stalled innovation, has stalled the progress that can likely be made in that area. In fact, the Innovative Vector Control Consortium, IVCC, has lately been working on this, and what they have been able to come up with is still far below what one would expect. It's going to take at least 5 years to consider the first set of new active ingredients. So there are standards, and especially technical standards, that are required for these products. Other areas to be aware of are that the countries where these diseases are very prevalent, WHO has conducted a survey and determined that quite a few of those countries, up to 10% of them, don't have any legislation, no pathway to regulate these products whatsoever. In fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's up to 30% of countries don't have these. And where they exist, it's either in Ministry of Agriculture, and in some countries they have it in both the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment and in the Ministry of Health. So and manufacturers and developers have no clue where to go. And so these are some of the issues around lack of clarity in the process that's involved in these products. Thank God for drugs and vaccines and ICH. Because that's a very clear pathway. Yes, it's not mandatory, but de facto, everybody plays by the same rule. So in fact, that's really the holy grail of harmonization, if you will. Yes, it took decades to accomplish. Do we have to do that for every other aspect of harmonization? No, but we have lessons that we can learn from them. But clearly, that has been one of the most successful harmonization approaches that has made it possible to fuel the engine of product development globally. I remember years ago, in my early days in the industry, where you have to file an application in the US and then completely repackage it to go to Japan and repackage it to go to EMA. And then, of course, now it's possible to just do one size fit all, more or less. So these are the kinds of areas that really you can see a lot of value can be seen. Some specific gaps when you look at the value chain that I mentioned earlier. Product development. The gaps that really exist, it's around how do you get clinical trials or trials in general, whether it's for drugs or for devices or for pest control products. How do you get them to be conducted in the regions where they're going to be of use? What is the technical requirement that is available for these trials to not only be approved, to be initiated, but also monitored? What about the infrastructure to ensure that we're able to enforce the standards themselves, whether it's the lab aspects of it or clinical practice, not to talk about manufacturing. In the registration purview, I mentioned the three-step process. You know, register here, here, and here. Do we need all three? Can the world be smarter in coming up with one? It's for us to figure out, all of us together. And the consistency of the standards between the various groups is another major barrier. How do we reduce duplication of the efforts that are carried out by the various streams that are looking at these products? And then from the post-registrational piece, it was interesting to hear the question of pharmacovigilance posed to Margaret earlier, and she answered it in a very, very nice way. But I think it's important to recognize that the post-registrational activities themselves need to be structured and need to be implemented in a way that allows for these products to be used, you know, in a value-added manner. How do we really have the structure to look for adverse events? How do we have the structure to analyze and interpret them? I know a lot of work is going on here. that Tom can talk about later, I'm sure. So the barriers can be bucketed into three or four buckets as I have them here. Diversity of countries. You know, so many different countries, they have different standards they're looking at, and the activities and their capabilities are different. How do we try to pick the best of what makes sense? Regulatory resources. There's not enough financial resources to ensure that the staffing, the human resource that are needed to technically implement some of these requirements, the resources are just not there. And of course, when it comes to trust and transparency, you would expect that with the dearth of resources, and can we just leapfrog from what has been done elsewhere? There's not enough trust to, you know, get a buy-in into that. And then, of course, manufacturers and product developers themselves don't have the same bandwidth when you compare the for-profit versus the non-profit product development partnerships. So there are good examples, and I've spread them over the landscape that I've shown here. From the clinical trials perspective, there are good examples in AVAREV, that's the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, which hopefully will go beyond vaccines and go into other areas, and perhaps beyond Africa. And then we have the EDCTP, which is increasingly beginning to foster international structures and, you know, places to get things done for as far as clinical trials are concerned. One good example is the collaborative effort on TB regimen development, which hopefully is going to result in a product coming in the next couple of years. Pre-registration, in the registrational space, the World Health Organization pre-qualification is a well-known scheme that tries to combine a lot of activities and supports the hundreds of countries that are member states of the UN. And of course, from a regional perspective, we've mentioned the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization. APEC has been cited by the speakers previously. PANDRA from PAHO, GCC from the Gulf states, and a whole variety of those are ongoing. And then when it gets to post-registrational aspects, WHO has been quite active in this from a pharmacovigilance standpoint. And of course, a new initiative that Tom and others have been leading is looking at building capacity in low-income countries and middle-income countries for pharmacovigilance. So the pesticide approach that I mentioned for WHO spans different aspects of this value chain. So finally, thoughts moving forward, we have to understand these issues as we plan for harmonization, whether of standards, of processes, of policies, stakeholder engagement. There are many issues that need to be addressed, but we have to be deliberate. And we have had a number of successes, one of which is a vaccine that was developed with standards that the private sector and the public sector work together and has been registered, and it's now being administered at a very low cost. So there's a lot of lessons that we can learn, and I think the future augurs well. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. We do have a few extra minutes, so if Doug and Vincent don't mind, we'll take a few minutes until 2 to see whether there are any points that people want to add and comment to what you've just heard or specific questions for our two speakers?